Mark chapter 7. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating foods with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders, instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules.' You've let go of the commandments of God and are holding on to human traditions." And he continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and 'Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death.' But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that is, devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that." Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them." After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person." Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. "First, let the children eat all they want," he told her, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Lord," she replied, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he told her, "For such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." She went home and found her child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There, some people brought him to a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hands on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, "Ephphatha," which means, "be opened." At this, the man's ears were opened. His tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. "He has done everything well," they said. "He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak."
So since we started looking at the Gospel of Mark back on Christmas Day, we've been going through each chapter, looking at all the things that Jesus taught people and the things that he did. And as we've been working through this book, we've seen that the big reason why it is that Jesus came was to proclaim the kingdom that he was bringing and to then also show glimpses of it. That every time he went around healing the sick, or he fed the starving, or he expelled demons and forgave people their sins, all these acts, these miracles, they're all showing what the kingdom will be once it is fully realized. Because when Jesus does come back at the end of the world, he will at that point make what is a new world. So what was all being shown the first time he came into this world, as he did all his ministry and he went around traveling from place to place, this is all just glimpses and a taste of what that perfect world will one day be like, as sickness and death itself are going to be no more, and where sin has been defeated and defeated once and for all, as all who believe are going to be right there before God's throne, and they're going to be there forever in his eternal kingdom. But now, having seen this being shown over the opening chapters of this book, well, as we get to this chapter now, as we look at this passage today, the big question is going to be, who is that kingdom for? Who's going to be the ones that get to enter into it? And on what basis will they get to enter into it? What is it that God is going to be looking for that will bring people into this place? And what is it that could possibly maybe disqualify people from entering and then being shut out forever? Because in this chapter, we actually get an answer to that. And we get to see that it's not the answer someone from that time would have expected. And if you were to go asking someone living in Jerusalem or Judea in the first century, who will be in God's kingdom? Who's God's kingdom for? Well, not only would they have had an idea of who they think will enter, but they also would have a pretty good idea of who they think won't enter. They would be thinking, no, those people, they're not going to be a part of God's kingdom. They're going to be thinking who it is that's good enough for God. And they're also going to be thinking who are the ones who are not good enough for God, who are the ones who are going to be locked out as who they are in their life. It's going to be an offense to him. And yet, as we now read of that time, now here we are 2,000 years later, we actually see that, well, the answer is it's the opposite of what people back then would have expected. That those entering are not going to be the ones seen as righteous by the people back then, and those locked out are going to be the ones who were seen as righteous, who are actually seen as being worthy of God. And that's because this chapter shows that the only requirement to enter the kingdom Jesus brings is faith leading to a changed heart. That there's several events that we're going to see here as we go through this chapter and the comments that Jesus makes. Well, they all follow the exact same thing, but it's not where someone comes from or who they were born from or how fortunate they've been in this world or even by what they have done, their actions in their past. But instead, it's about having just true faith in Jesus and having been changed from within by him. It's going to be about trusting in him and depending completely on his grace. And it's absolutely not going to be thinking of yourself as being worthy based on who you are or what you've done. That the moment you're thinking that you're good enough, then that is when you are going to be disqualified. And as that will be the condition, this is why we actually see what is a massive contrast presented here between those who do have faith and also those who think that they are good enough themselves. Because those who can actually see Jesus and they can hear his words, they're going to be very different to those that we see who are blind and deaf to them due to what is their own self-righteousness. And of course, it's going to mean that the ones who at least expect to enter the kingdom, based on what was expected back then, will be the ones who will enter. That even today, people have an idea of who they think would enter into heaven. But what we're going to see is it's actually going to be many surprises in heaven, as the first will be last and the last will be first, because of actually what we're seeing here. That just because someone looks like they're winning with God and looks like they're kingdom material does not mean that they actually are. That's a mistake people today make. They think that person's good enough, that person's not. And therefore, just because someone seems to be losing and they look like they're coming last does not mean that God does not have a place for them in his kingdom, and they therefore will one day be first. So looking at the passage now, and starting with the first half of this chapter, so a big chunk, it's going to be verses 1 to 23. This shows that it's what it is to not accept Jesus and to not be convicted by the gospel message that he brought. And how we see this play out is that, yet again, Jesus gets into yet another confrontation with the Pharisees as they're going to question him regarding matters of what is their law. It's the law that they hold to, which we've got to remember is not necessarily God's law as we read in the Old Testament. It's not always the same thing, but it's the self-imposed rules that they have created, that they're governed by, that they want their society and culture governed by as they try to make sure that they don't fall foul of what is the laws of the Old Testament. And the particular issue that they have this time comes from the fact that Jesus and those who are with him, the disciples, are eating food with their hands that have not been washed properly. Or at the very least, that is the official reason that's been raised by them here. Because as we've already seen throughout Mark, these people have been looking for any little thing in which to find fault with the actions of the disciples so as to attempt to then disgrace Jesus in public. As we saw back in chapter 3, it's said in verse 6 that after they raised issues with them on the disciples healing on the Sabbath, that they then tried to test him and see what he would do for what was the injured man on the Sabbath. And it said there, then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So that was showing up from now on. They're no longer talking to Jesus because they're trying to figure out who he is. And they're trying to work out for themselves, should we be following this man or not? But they've actually already decided not to follow him. They've decided that he's a danger to them. He's a danger to their society and all that they believe. Hence why they accused him of using what is the power of Satan straight after that event in the synagogue, as they're now seeing him as evil. They're definitely not seeing him as potentially being from God. They're now seeing him as being from the devil. He's a threat and he has to be eliminated. And this here that we get in our passage now, this is simply a part of that plot that we've already read about now playing out. That they want the people to see Jesus as what is as a lawbreaker, a rule breaker, so they can justify opposing him and ultimately getting rid of him. And that means that they're going to have to now discredit him at every opportunity. They're looking for something that they can hold against him so that they can then show to everyone, look, Jesus is the enemy and he needs to be dealt with. And that motive that they've got to catch him out, well, it becomes obvious just in the first verse, because it starts here by saying the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus. So we see that they've now come to Jesus from Jerusalem, but we ended chapter 6 just before this with Jesus being on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. So this means that they've traveled more than 150 kilometers just to get to him. And of course, this back at a time when you couldn't just jump in the car on a highway or jump in a train and travel those kind of distances in just an hour or two. So if you're making that type of effort, you're either coming to follow him, as we've seen some people have done, they've traveled incredible distances to follow him, or you're coming to confront him, which has actually been the pattern of the Pharisees so far. Because there really would be literally no other reason to travel all that way unless you've got a strong motive to do so. They're coming for a purpose. And this motive to confront him and discredit him, it actually becomes quite clear when we see the nitpicking issue that they're going to raise the moment that they see him. Because it says here that they saw some of the disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. And then we get it explained to us as to why this here would be such an issue for them at that time. Why it is that they've jumped on this. Because it says in verse 3, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they have given their hands a ceremonial washing holding to the tradition of the elders. So we can see that this hand washing, it's a custom, a cultural custom that they have. As it does not say here, according to the scriptures, as we often see being said when something does come from God's law, when God said, you must do this, but instead this is just a tradition of the elders. It's something that's grown over time. It's not something that God told all the Israelites to do. It's a ceremonial hand washing. It's not even just one to keep your hands clean before you touch food. It's got a bigger, deeper purpose, but it's not something that God has told everyone to do. And we see in verse 4 just what this tradition looked like in practice, as it talks about how to not eat after going to the marketplace, and how they even had to do the ceremonial washing for all the utensils, anything that they were using regarding the food. So this is the rule that the Pharisees, that they live by, and it's the one that they now want everyone to live by. They're trying to impose this on everyone. Not imposing the laws that God has given the people to follow, but just the ones that they themselves have lived by. A tradition that they've made for themselves over what is many, many centuries. Which is why we now see them ask Jesus, verse 5, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with what is defiled hands? So this is going to be what they think will catch Jesus out and now turn people against him. The fact that his disciples are not following what is their customs. Like back in chapter 2 with the issue of fasting and the disciples eating. And also the questions of the Sabbath and the disciples at the time picking grain on that day. They're just trying to get to Jesus through his disciples. Discredit them, then you can discredit him. And they're obviously doing this because they seem to think that if they can show that his closest followers are sinful or heretical and not obeying God, as they say, should be done, then this is going to show that obviously Jesus could not be a follower of God. He can't be who he's pretending to be. He can't be legitimate. So this is why this hand washing issue itself, this is obviously not the real problem going on, right? That's not what's driving them here. The purpose instead is simply finding a fault. It's finding any fault so as to bring Jesus down and then to stop the people following and listening to him. Obviously stop them from following him as opposed to following themselves. This is why that they're willing to travel all over the region to come to him, because it's in the hopes of just finding something, anything that can now show Jesus in a bad light. And for this meeting, they've raised the issues of his disciples breaking what is their regulations in regards to the ceremonial washing of hands. That they've simply gone for what is a gotcha moment that they hope is going to ultimately bring Jesus down. But now, having had what they think is the gotcha moment, we now see Jesus' reply to this. And Jesus' reply is going to be extremely blunt. Because what we see as we go through the Gospels is that the more the religious leaders come after him in this way, the more their motives are corrupted. Then the more direct his responses comes to them. That he starts to pull his punches less and less as time goes on. And he makes it very clear that they are very corrupt and they're heart of heart, that they've rejected God. That's the problem, the issues with them. So what we see here is that he plainly says that they're hypocrites. And that whilst they appear righteous to others by doing all these sort of customs and rules, their way of life is to follow just the rules and regulations which have been made by themselves and not by God. And that whilst they therefore appear to be godly and that they're committed to their customs, and whilst they say that they do all these things because they love God and that they want to be right with him, well, the truth is that they're only believing in themselves and their own rules, and their righteousness is actually all fake. And it's fake because they only follow these rules and regulations simply to appear right amongst themselves and in front of others. That's what they want. They just want others to look at them and go, wow, you're great. None of what they say and do is coming from a place of them actually genuinely loving God. Their motives are simply corrupt. Hence why, in response to the issue that they've raised, this hand-washing problem, we see Jesus now quotes Isaiah. And he does this so as to show that they are, in fact, hypocrites. And they're the hypocrites that were actually prophesied about. That when Isaiah warned the Israelites of those who pretend to worship God and to follow his ways, but when that warning went out, it was actually about those like these Pharisees here that he was speaking about. He's saying this is what's going to happen. There are going to be men who claim to follow God, but it's all a show. Because he quotes Isaiah here. Jesus quotes him. It says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. And he then even adds a little bit by himself, right, to make sure that the message is clear. Because he also states, you have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. So this is a moment, this is where Jesus is exposing their heart. And he's showing that the Pharisees, despite what they're there for and what people think they're there for and what they claim to be there for, they do not actually live for God, but instead they actually live for this self-righteousness, just presenting themselves as being right with God. That all their actions, it's all about glorifying themselves. And it does not come from a place of genuine faith. It's not devotion. It's just an act that deep down, they would actually rather reject God and his ways as long as it made them look good doing that. It's how they appear that matters to them more than anything. Because in the end, how they present themselves to others is obviously, we can see it, it's going to be more important to them than doing what is right. This is why they're rejecting who we know as the Son of God. Because whilst they appear to be the godliest of them all, and the ones that you would expect to follow Jesus, the one you would expect to be going into the kingdom, and the ones that you would expect to be able to recognize who Jesus is, that he's the Son of God, and to be the ones who would naturally, therefore, be the ones putting their faith in him, to be kingdom material. But what they've become instead is the very people who reject Jesus the most. That's the problem. And that the way they're living, it's never been about God at any time. They're complaining about the washing of hands, their own rules that they've created. But when you look at their life, they don't actually follow God's commands. That's the problem. They've almost got two opposing things here, and they've chosen human rules over God's. So they do not actually hold to the very thing that matters the most. And where their true devotion and godliness comes from is not a place of genuine faith and love. And this is exactly what we see Jesus now explain, as he's going to give a very clear example of how they get this wrong, how these two things are actually opposed to each other, and shows where their heart is. That the way that they're putting their own rules ahead of God's means that they're even prepared to break God's commandments if it suits them, if they have a choice between the two. Because he says in verse 10 that where God said to honor your mother and father, that they have completely neglected this responsibility. They haven't followed that commandment. And the way that they've neglected it, how they've done that, is by claiming that the effort, the energy, the time that they would have given to their mother and father is now being transferred into giving it to God. So even though they're neglecting their parents, it's actually okay. That by their reasoning, they haven't really neglected their responsibilities, but instead they've simply substituted it with what is a greater responsibility. That as long as they're too busy honoring God, then that means that they're justified in not honoring their mother and father as the devotion that should have been to them. It's now just been transferred to something better, right? They've given all that time and energy to a higher calling. But what we see here as we read on is that kind of thinking, it's all wrong. But this is not what God wants from them, and it shows that they don't actually follow him, because he does not want them or anyone else creating what is loopholes to get out of living right and following what is his clear commands. And he doesn't want some sort of restrictive rules and regulations created in what is a vain attempt to show some kind of devotion just because they're hard to follow. Because trying to hold onto these things becomes a life commitment, showing some kind of sacrifice for God, even to the point of actually breaking the other commitments that they should have. And he does not want them following all these rules and traditions created by themselves and then putting all their effort into holding to these rules and traditions at what is the neglect of just loving him, of just trusting him, of just doing what is right, the very thing that he's told them to do. Because it's obvious God's commands, they are to come first. And that the only way to truly honor God, the only way to worship him is to follow his commands. We can't know more about worshiping God than what God himself has told us to do. So obviously we're not to follow our own path and then to claim that this path that we've made difficult for ourselves and has meant that we've had to not do the other things we're supposed to do somehow proves your devotion to God. It's an idiotic way of thinking. It so clearly does not show true love and devotion to God. Which is why Jesus is simply saying to them, you're more worried about my disciples not washing their hands by your own customs than you are in following what is God's clear commands. That they've come all this way to find him in order to just nitpick his disciples for not following what is their rules. Whilst at the same time, whilst they do that, while they judge the disciples and say, oh, look, you're not following our rules, they're ignoring God's rules. This is why they're hypocrites, because they judge others as not living right for God, not being good enough for God's kingdom, whilst they themselves don't live for God. And they're not right. They're not good enough. Because whilst they claim to live for God and to honor him, as the Isaiah quote shows, their hearts are actually far from him. It's all just a waste of time. It doesn't impress God, and it shows that they're actually not genuine. And we see why this is the case, now explained, as we continue to read on, as Jesus shows by an illustration of why these customs of theirs just cannot work. Why trying to live by all these regulations and these rules that they've created, it does not make them come closer to God, because all they can do is change their behavior, but not their heart, not their motive, not the reason why they're actually doing these things. That they could appear to be right with God. They could get all the praise from the people for being so righteous, being worthy. But the real question is going to be, the one that God's going to ask is, what is really going on in their heart? And no amount of hand washing is ever going to change that. So it's all a waste of time. That only those who live for God will enter the kingdom, and it's not going to be by simply appearing to be good enough in your own mind. Because we see Jesus now say to the crowd, starting in verse 14, as he gives this illustration, the reason why such rules don't work. He says, nothing outside of a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it's what comes out of a person that defiles them. So the point here is going to be, when you think about the sin in a person, and you think about their standing before God, when you think about if they've repented or if they've trusted in God and they're devoted to him genuinely, then that is always going to come down to what is inside of the person and not if they've been performing a particular act or not. But whether they wash their hands or not is not going to make a difference as to if they truly trust God. Not doing this ceremonial washing and then thinking that the food is defiled is not what's actually going to change their heart inside. Eating the food is just not going to have that kind of impact. And the reason is because if they do, in fact, love God and they want to worship him, it's got to be something that does come from within. And it's got to come from having a changed heart. So you simply can't make that happen by just doing or not doing certain things. That's the point here. The Pharisees, they've tried to make themselves right. The whole culture of that group, how they operate, what they teach, they think it's all by their regulations. But those regulations, what they do, it can't change what is within them. And if they live without true love for God, then all those acts, they're meaningless. It's not changing that standing that they have before God. Now, to be clear, that does not mean that our actions and how we live means nothing at all. Because obviously, as we see, most of the New Testament continuously points to the fact that what we do, it does in fact matter. So James, for example, says that faith without deeds is dead. And of course, we see Jesus himself say, by this fruit you will recognize. Obviously, what we're doing does represent and show something. But what it's showing is that if your heart has been transformed, then that is what's going to show by how you live, by your actions. So if you do not show love and help those around you, then the question is, has your heart really been transformed? That's the problem. If you're not living the way God told us to live, not following his commands, then do you really love him? Do you really trust him? And if you have been transformed inside, then that means, of course, that your actions will now reflect that. That's where your heart is at. So it's not that our actions don't matter, but the point here is that actions have to come from what is inside and not just trying to cover over what is inside by those outward acts. But if you help someone because you love them, then that love has come from the heart and is therefore a reflection of that. It's showing who you really are. But if you hate someone, then even if you do a good deed for them, that's not going to then remove the hate that's inside. That the heart determines the action, but the action, even if good, will not change the heart. As we see him say from verse 20, what comes out of a person is what defiles them, for it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. And that is where the Pharisees have got it all wrong. This is where they've got it all backwards. They're trying to hide what's inside by what they do on the outside. Jesus is saying what's inside will come out. It's a one-way street. Those who truly love God, they don't do God so as to be right with God. Instead, they do good because they are right with God. It's simply because God has transformed them on the inside, and therefore the good, it flows from them. So if we today want to be right with God, then the change, it has to happen on the inside, not the outside. That you can't come up with rules and customs that, like the Pharisees here have, because it's not going to change what's on the inside. It can change your actions, it can't change your heart. It doesn't work. Because you could follow these kind of customs 100% perfectly, and you can still hate God with all your heart. That's the problem. That's what we see with the Pharisees here. They don't love God. So what you do with your hands and the actions you take, it doesn't change. You're standing before God. But in contrast to that, if your heart has been transformed by God and you now live for him, then your actions will reflect what's inside your heart. It will reflect this standing that you now have before him. The worship will come from the heart and not just the mouth, and it will be true worship, the true worship of what is a true convert, the devotion that can only come from someone who truly loves God, has their faith in Christ, and now lives for him in every part of their life. So this is the big thing we see about the gospel, and the thing that we see in the early church and right through the New Testament. But those who you would imagine to put their faith in Jesus, those who seemed and claimed to love God the most, the ones that seemed to be halfway there because of all their religious devotion, they were actually the furthest from him. In the end, those things actually blocked them from having that faith. But they did not love him, even if they said they did. And it shows that those who you would expect to be of God's kingdom and who you would imagine being the most faithful can turn out to be the ones who actually are not of the kingdom. They're the ones who reject Jesus the hardest. Even today, those who may appear to be the most faithful, they seem to be ticking all the boxes. If they're only doing it just to tick the boxes, then they don't have that true faith. They're not actually of the kingdom. That's the big warning here. That's the warning we see with the Pharisees. They appeared to be halfway there, but in the end, they were the furthest away. But now, having firstly seen who is not fit for the kingdom and who will not trust in Jesus, well, this is where it now moves into the second half of this chapter and to a couple of other people whose views and attitudes are going to be very different to what we've just looked at. Because whilst the first half of this chapter dealt with the issue of the Pharisees and the Jews following traditions and not truly following God, well, here we see people who do truly have faith in Jesus and are what true converts should look like. That these are the people of the kingdom, even if at the time that this was all happening, these are the people that would be least expected to be welcomed into God's kingdom. And there are going to be two parts to this section, because the first is about a woman with a young girl who's possessed with a demon, and the second is about a man with several severe disabilities, making really life almost impossible. And yet what we're going to see from these two people is that they're going to have more faith coming from them and more devotion to God than what is the religious leaders that we just looked at. That those who we've seen, they've actually rejected God from the depth of their heart. Whilst these people who are on the outside of the community at that time, actually inside, really do trust in God. So looking at the woman first off, the most important thing to notice is that she's a Greek and that she's from the far north, that she comes from Syria, not even Israel itself, right? She's a foreigner. And that is going to be really significant because this means that this is not a person who Jesus has come to for his earthly ministry, but instead through faith, she's now gone to him. She's seeking him out. And we don't know a lot about the circumstances that this woman was in from this passage. It doesn't really tell us that much because we don't know what she's done in the past to help her daughter or what kind of understanding she has of the Jewish beliefs, the prophecies, right? Whether she herself has been waiting for the Messiah to come. We don't know what her position was before this moment. But whilst a lot of the information is limited here, what we do know is that our actions towards Jesus are the complete opposite of the Pharisees we just read about. Because we see that after Jesus moved what is far northwest, right, now towards the coast and what is far north as modern day Lebanon, that's where he is now. Very long way from the Sea of Galilee where he just was. We see that when he now enters into this area of the city of Tyre, a woman comes to him, and it says about her in verse 26, she begged Jesus to drive the demons out of her daughter. So what we can just see by that is she believes that he can help her. She hasn't come to him to make a fool of him. She hasn't come to him to try to catch him out, like the Pharisees were doing. We see that she's genuinely in need. And what's important is that she believes Jesus can fix this. There's a trust right there already in who he is. But then we see Jesus reply to this request. And it's actually a bit of a surprise. The reply is not what you'd expect compared to what we've seen him say to others elsewhere with similar needs. Because he says, first let the children eat all they want, he told her. For it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. And there's a reason why he says this. It sounds incredibly harsh, but we do see an explanation elsewhere for why Jesus had this position, this attitude. Because we see Jesus say to his disciples, if we go to the Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 10, in verses 5 and 6, as he sends them out with the gospel. That's what he's doing. He's sending them all out, as we talked about before. We see him say to them, do not go among the Gentiles or into any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. And then also later on in Matthew 15, verse 24, he says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. So we can see that when Jesus came, that he came with a plan, that there was a purpose, as we know, ultimately it led to the cross. So it was all mapped out. And a part of that plan, the map, was only to go to the Jews and not to others. That was the focus of his ministry. He only walked for a few years from the time he was baptized to the time he died. And in that time, he's just focused on going to the lost sheep of Israel. Now, of course, after he died and rose again, that all changed, because we clearly see him say at the end of Matthew, right, the same gospel in Matthew 28, go and make disciples of all nations. And of course, Acts 1 starts off, before the church has even begun, he says, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. So that's showing that the gospel message, it is clearly for everyone, and it wasn't to be withheld from anyone, no matter where they came from. That's the big promise of the church. It is for everyone. The kingdom is for everyone. But when he first came, he did only go to the Jews first. His ministry was focused only on Israel, even if at times he did speak to people not of Israel. And we're actually seeing that play out here, because her reply, like what we see with the faithful centurion in Matthew 8, is what is going to change that, is he's going to make an exception in this case. And an exception based on her faith, because after saying he won't do this, she says, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And this humbleness that she has, she's not arguing it, she's not fighting it, but she's saying, can I still have the crumbs? This leads to him saying, for such a reply, you may go, the demon has left your daughter. So unlike the Pharisees who came to Jesus with what is a hard heart, well, she comes to him with humbleness and complete faith. And whilst they claim to live for God, yet do not, she, despite being a Greek and having been born what is outside of Israel in a foreign nation, has actually shown genuine faith. So what this means is those who are supposed to be God's people and have a love for him are actually unable to see him standing right before them. And in contrast to that, this woman who is not a part of those who are considered to be God's people, she can see who Jesus is, that she has the faith in him and that he does have power over the evil spirits and that he will help her. She believes all that, which is why this is now the complete opposite of what someone there at the time would have expected these responses to be. That the ones that you expect to follow Jesus are the ones who are actually, in fact, living in rejection of him, no matter how they might appear, and the ones who are the foreigner. That's the one who's actually the true convert. That's the one who is of the kingdom. And of course, this clearly shows that those who are actually God's people are not necessarily going to be people from Israel. That while Jesus has come to Israel, Jesus extends his saving grace to all the people of the world. But in the end, God's people are not from any one particular nation, but it's just those who simply have their faith in him. They, the faithful, they are the people of God's kingdom. And it's through this contrast of responses that this is how we're starting to see what is the unexpected converts who are coming into the kingdom. That those who would expect to recognize Jesus and to have his favor are the ones who can't see it. The Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the Jewish people, many of them just can't see who Jesus is, despite pretending to be the most faithful to God. And because they do not actually have faith and they do not worship the true God, then they're therefore outside of the kingdom. Which is why in the end, it ends up being the one who's not actually a part of God's people that really is a part of God's kingdom. That's the point. That's the big thing to get from this. It's the person back then that no one would have expected to trust in God who has actually ended up showing the most faith of all. And as we read on, we now see something similar in what is the last section of this chapter, from verse 31 to the end. It's another example of how someone who you would not expect coming into the kingdom ahead of those, like the Pharisees, being the one who actually has true faith. Because we see here that Jesus moves to yet another region. He's now moving inland. He's back towards the Sea of Galilee. And here he finds a man who is in a very bad way. That he has a couple of disabilities, as he can't talk and he can't even hear. And this is going to create what is the interesting contrast between himself and the Pharisees, as these particular disabilities are only going to highlight the criticism Jesus had of them due to their hypocrisy. Because at the start of our passage, we saw that the Pharisees insisted on going through what was a number of physical rituals in which to keep themselves clean, to keep themselves right with God. And we saw Jesus criticizing them for being hypocrites in this matter, as they were saying and doing one thing whilst believing and thinking another. That they only gave lip service that Isaiah warned about, not true devotion. And on top of that, we also saw, as we've seen right through the entire book of Mark so far, they're unable to hear what Jesus is saying to them. That his words, they always just fall on deaf ears. As their hard-heartedness, it stops them from hearing the message of the kingdom that he brought. They can't repent because they just can't hear the warnings, can't hear the promises that he gives. But of course, what we know is these Pharisees, they're in good health. They just traveled 150 Ks just to try and catch him out. They've got their health. They have ears that work. They've got a tongue that works. And now we get a man who is not so fortunate to be in that good health because he is deaf and he can't speak. And yet when Jesus says to him in verse 34, be opened, it then says that the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. And of course, this only illustrates what Jesus was saying before about how what is presented on the outside and what happens on the outside does not change the inside. But what is inside, well, that's what then changes the outside. Because now the one who is unable to shout praises to God, a man who's unable to get up and make those long prayers in God's name and can't do this because his tongue physically just does not work. Well, he's the one that actually has the faith to be made well. He's the one who's got the true trust in God. So whilst those who have working tongues like the Pharisees are unable to give genuine worship to God, we see that it's the mute man who is the one who is actually genuine. He's the one who truly loves God. And likewise, those who have working ears, like the Pharisees, they can't hear Jesus' words. But the ones whose ears are physically closed, he's the one who actually hears God's words and shows genuine faith in him. So when Jesus says, be open, his ears are opened. So just like the section beforehand, it's the ones that you wouldn't expect to be a part of God's kingdom that actually recognize who Jesus is. It's the ones that at the time people would be saying, she's a foreigner, not welcome. He's deaf and blind. He must have done something terrible. He's a sinner. And it's the ones at the same time who you would expect to be a part of God's kingdom. And be a part because they're a part of God's nation. They're from the land of Israel. And because they every day live in devotion to these laws and make every part of their life dedicated to these regulations that are supposedly showing commitment to God. Well, we see that despite this, they're the ones who have no idea who God is. Everything here is upside down. So what we see is that the ones who come to Jesus humbly are the ones that Jesus responds to, irrespective of where they come from, or what their past was, or how anyone else sees them. And the ones who believe themselves to be right because of where they come from, because of their many sacrifices and works. Well, they're the ones who Jesus says are actually unclean, defiled on the inside. Whilst they claim to know God, they don't, so they're not a part of the kingdom, and sadly, they never will be. Which is why we see that it all becomes the very opposite of what anyone back then would have expected simply by looking from the outside. And a warning today that it could be very backwards to what people today might expect. Because just by seeing these different groups and who you would assume from the outside was part of the kingdom of God, we see God sees it very differently. And it's because Jesus makes it clear it's what's on the inside that matters. The true faith is not in outward acts, but is instead simply trust and genuine devotion to God. And despite what the Jews had believed at that time, it's only by a transformed heart and actually having what is humble faith. That's the important part. The humbleness to trust in God. Well, that is what God looks for. That's what God desires. Not holding to shallow traditions and regulations, even if from the outside it makes someone look righteous, makes them look good, and makes them look like they're the ones closest to the kingdom. So through all this, these different events that we see in this chapter, well, we actually now have an answer to that question at the start. Who is that kingdom for? That Jesus brought the kingdom, who is it for? And we can see that just by looking here, who it is that Jesus accepted and who he rejected. And then we can see that the kingdom is simply for those who have faith in him, those who are humble enough to trust in him and do not depend on themselves to be good enough for it. Because being accepted by God into his kingdom, it's clearly not about being born into the right people. That even though the Jews thought just by being from Israel that this would mean that they would be good enough, we see that Jesus helps a Greek woman here born from a very long way away. And if that is the case, then it means that even today, it's not about being born into a Christian nation or being born into a Christian family. That you can't just be right with God just because someone else is. It doesn't just transfer in that way. Instead, we come into the kingdom by our own faith, not someone else's. We each individually need to trust in Jesus for our salvation. And likewise, entering the kingdom is clearly not about going through certain traditions and rituals so as to please God, as the Jews back then thought. And of course, that therefore means today, it's not about making sure that you read the Bible every single day or that you go to church every week so as to keep God happy, that you're ticking those boxes. Instead, what we see is true faith comes from the inside. So we do those things. We read God's word, we come to church, but it's because we're trusting in God first. That is where it starts. That the inside shapes the actions, not the outward actions, not forcing ourselves to do something, shaping the inside. Which is why being a part of this kingdom, it simply means having that one thing. It's having faith in Jesus. That's the clear answer, that we get to the question of who is the kingdom for based on what we see in this chapter. That it is for those who trust in him and for those that make no other claim of entry to get in. That's the important thing. No claim of birthright. The Greek woman was happy to accept that she was not of Israel, but still trusted him anyway. And no claim of having been good enough by our actions. No self-righteousness. Instead, if we want to be a part of the kingdom Jesus brings, then what we do is we surrender everything. And by surrendering everything, we solely trust in him. So to finish, how about I pray for that now? That when we come before God, that we actually come with the kind of faith that we're seeing in this chapter. And that we'll never make the mistake of the Pharisees here of depending on a birthright or outward acts of devotion, but to only trust in one thing. The love of Christ and the grace that he has for us to save us from our sin and to ultimately, in the end, bring us into his kingdom. Let's pray. Father, we pray, having looked at this passage, that we'll be ever mindful of the dangers in becoming complacent to all that you have given us. Instead, we ask that you will soften our heart so as to always be humble and mindful of how our relationship with you is in fact truly by faith alone. Amen.